Um, Welcome to this first class session on Lighthall. This is a new platform for online learning. It looks very robust, and I was invited to take part in the beta. And what's really cool about Lighthall is they specialize in live interactive sessions with the idea, as the CEO of it explained to me, that there's something that people really enjoy about getting to interact with somebody and getting to interact with each other in the chat. So I think I'll probably be working with this quite a bit in the future. Those of you, I think everybody probably knows me, but maybe not everybody knows all the different parts of what I do. I'm the editor of Stoicism Today. I'm also the president of my own company, Reason.io. I teach at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. I'm the co-host of the Wisdom for Life radio show, and as many of you know, I think I do a lot of video production and other things as well. And so Lighthall reached out to me, and I think it's mainly on account of the YouTube channel. They said, "Would you like to try out our new platform?" And they walked me through some of the features of it, and I thought, well, this looks really good. This looks like it has some real promise. This is a lot like YouTube Live, except as I think some of you are seeing, it's got a lot more cool features. And so I really kind of like this. So I thought, well, what should I do a class session on? And I thought, well, Stoicism is something that a lot of people are very interested in now. So we'll focus on Stoic philosophy and practice. And then zeroing in, I decided to focus on my favorite Stoic author, who is Epictetus. He's long been my favorite Stoic author. And even though I really do like Seneca and other people, I think, Epictetus kind of holds constant in that. And then I thought, I'll zero in even more on one particular work of Epictetus. We have the longer discourses, and then we have the shorter Enchiridion or handbook. So I thought, well, we'll do that. And then I thought, well, we need to zero in even more. We're not going to cover the whole Enchiridion. So let's focus on 5 basic Stoic practices that Epictetus talks about, not necessarily naming in the same way that we're naming them here, but he talks about in that text, the Enchiridion. So I decided I would pick 5 that I myself find very useful in my own life and work. And actually, Andy is on the call with me here. She's my wife and partner, and she finds these useful because we have, we use a lot of these things to negotiate the fact of being 2 pretty type A people who live and work and love together. So I think these can be very useful for all of you. And so the first one is the dichotomy of control. The second one is depersonalizing problems. The third is paying tranquility's price. The fourth is valuing your will, or prohairesis. And then the fifth is picking up the right handle. Why 5? Why not just 3 or just 1, or why not more? I think that 5 is a good number for a class like this. We have about 90 minutes. And so I think we can cover all of these pretty well and address any confusions or questions or stuff like that. And I do want to say something right off the bat. You shouldn't feel yourself under pressure to internalize all 5 of these and come away from this, ready to rock, so to speak. If you only get 3 of them, that's fine. That still makes a difference. These are things that can be not just intellectually interesting, but they make a difference in your life. And so even if you walk away from this with just 1 that you can use to develop a bit more resiliency and orientation towards happiness and calm and tranquility in your life, I think that's an achievement. So that's really quite helpful. The other thing I do want to point out, so in the handout that I gave you on the passages, I'm going to be referencing one particular translation of Epictetus. And I'm not doing that because I'm endorsing it as the better one. I'm just doing it out of a let's just say laziness. I use the Old Father translation because it's there in my Loeb edition as the English on the facing page of the Greek. And I think it's not a bad translation. So, you could find other translations of these passages. I'm just providing you with the Old Father one there. So I do also want to say something about philosophical practices. That's a term that we're using here. You'll also in the literature, like if you study Pierre Hadot, he calls them spiritual exercises. Michel Foucault calls them technologies of the self, but they're all basically the same thing. You're taking some ideas and then you're actually doing something with them in the course of your life. You're practicing. So we don't have to get too hung up on the terminology itself. I do also want to say that, Hadot is not the only person, of course, who talks about this concept of philosophy as a way of life. There's many, many others. I've written about this elsewhere. But it is a nice catchphrase. Philosophy as a way of life uses philosophical practices, but there's more than just philosophical practices. And likewise, there's Stoicism than just these practices that we're going to be looking at. Another thing to say about these is these are not, simple learn it once and you've got it down kind of cookie cutter life hacks, right? Each of these that we're going to look at is something that as you work with, you get better and better at it, and with it, and you're getting better and better at it, and sometimes failing, you come to understand it more fully. So it's not like, learn it, apply it, there's a dialectic back and forth with you. The more that you apply them and reflect on them, we may have some people here who've been, using these Stoic practices for many years. You learn more about them, you acquire more insights about them and about yourself. And typically are going to have sort of interconnected cognitive, that's thought, right? Affective, that's mood or emotion, choice, and action dimensions or components to them. So with each of these 5 exercises, we're going to look at the relevant passage or passages from the Enchiridion, and then we'll discuss some of the basic concepts or ideas that are involved in the practice. I'll point out ways that beginners can get mixed up about this. I'm not assuming that everybody here is a beginner, but I'm assuming that some people are, and so there's ways in which sometimes we lead people off track. We'll look at some examples that Epictetus himself provides in the Enchiridion. One of the cool things about each of these practices is it's not just in that one chapter where he talks about it, it's also discussed in other places. And then we'll look at some contemporary examples. I've got some for you. I'm sure that some of you will come up with some examples as well. And I was thinking that after each of these practices, we'll take a little pause for Q&A for any questions that come up, or, am I doing this right, or that sort of thing. And we'll also, I think, have time for more general Q&A and discussion after we go through all of these, because I've budgeted 90 minutes. I think that should probably be enough. That's one of the things, though, with live classes. You never quite know, right? Whether how long things are going to take, or how much time you're going to spend on each thing. That's a little bit of the charm of it, I suppose, right? So let's talk about the first practice. This is one that I think a lot of people are very familiar with, and they're familiar with it under this name, the dichotomy of control. If you've read William Irvine's book, he proposes a trichotomy of control. We can talk about that if people are really interested in that, but I don't think that's particularly necessary here. So what is the relevant passage? It's at the very beginning of the Enchiridion. And we should keep in mind too that Epictetus, he's the one who said the things in the Enchiridion, but he's not the person who wrote them down or who arranged it. So it's his student Arian who thought that this was, really the most important thing to start with. And it runs like this. Some things are under our control, while other things are not under our control. Under our control are conception, choice, desire, aversion, and in a word, everything that is our own doing. Not under our control are our body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, everything that is not our own doing. Remember, therefore, that if what is naturally slavish you think to be free, and what is not your own to be your own, you will be hampered, will grieve, will be in turmoil, and will blame both gods and men. While if you think only what is your own to be your own, and what to be is not your own, then no one will be able to exert compulsion upon you. No one will hinder you. No one will blame. You will blame no one, will find fault with no one, will do absolutely nothing against your will. You will have no personal enemy. No one will harm you, for neither is there any harm that can touch you. Okay, so those are some big promises, right? But he is laying out for us a very important distinction and a very helpful thing that we can do, and that's the philosophical practice. You could say there's a concept, or very important distinction, and then there's what you're actually doing with it. Now, here is where it is helpful to talk a little bit about terminology. So the distinction in the Greek is not between what is in our control and what is not in our control. That's a way of translating it. Another way of translating it is in our power, not in our power. Sometimes people get very focused on, well, what exactly counts as power, what counts as control. And that's kind of losing the thread, because literally it means what is up to us. What is our business is another way of translating it. What is something that falls within our purview? And so there's a distinction between all these things that are external, including our body, and we're gonna talk about that in a bit, and then all these things that are internal to us. One set we have control over, or we get to decide, or we're determinative, right? And the other stuff, we can have some input into it, but ultimately somebody or something else is calling the shots. Something else is determining what happens. So this is a really important distinction. And it is important to point out that Epictetus thinks that we do have some input, and we can exercise, prudence or courage or whatever in relation to those external things like reputation. Online reputation would be something Epictetus hasn't thought of, but could matter to us quite a bit. Property, right? The things that we own, or income streams, or whatever. And notice what is in our control that he's not naming here, but if you read between the lines, it is in our control whether or not we have a right understanding of this distinction and about things. If we think that things are outside of our control are really up to us, that's a choice on our part that we don't have to make. It is in what we do with this distinction, whether we focus on the things in our control, directing our desires, aversions towards those, like deciding I want to be a better person. That's in your control, according to Epictetus. Everybody else liking you, not in your control, right? So if you redirect your desire or your aversions towards what you actually do have control over, you're going to be, as he says, you're going to be free. You're going to be, nobody's going to get in your way, and so one key addition, we don't control all the results or outcomes. Even if we have the best intentions, even if we plan, as much as we can, we don't control all the factors, but we do control what we decide to do in terms of responses and how we use things. So, your body, not totally in your control. As a matter of fact, great example, having COVID just, a week and a half ago, I think I tested negative. When I took the test, I don't control, I control whether I do the test, but I don't control what the results are. It's the things that are going on in my body that determine that, right? Now, how do beginners get mixed up about this? This is very common, by the way. So if you do get mixed up about this, you don't have to feel bad about that. You just want to sort of like, figure out how you're going to do better with it. The biggest way, I would say, is mistaking things being up to us with something that we have total control over in every aspect. So the fact that I do control, for example, desire and aversion, how I direct those, doesn't mean that I don't already come into the world with desires and aversions and that I haven't developed them over time, and that changing habits may take a while for me, So that's one key thing to focus on. Another big mistake that I see people making is focusing totally on this passage and then ignoring all the other things that Epictetus says elsewhere about what's in our power, what's in our control, and what's not in our control, including in the Enchiridion, but in the discourses. And then, quibbling about counterexamples. For example, you could say, well, I don't control my thoughts. I have intrusive thoughts. I have obsessive thoughts that affect me, or I have feelings that I can't control. Well, Epictetus would say, okay, granted, what do you control about that? Let's say that you suffer from depression, as I do. I'm diagnosed with mild to moderate depression, have dealt with it for, since my teens. Let's say you start feeling negative, mood, and you start engaging in what we call negative self-talk. You may have intrusive thoughts. You may have, a down mood. You decide what you're going to do with that. I mean, you can't like snap your fingers and suddenly everything is okay, but you do still have some measure of control, and you can focus on what you actually do have some measure of control over, right? So let's look at some examples, and then there's some good questions here already. Epictetus says in chapter 24, let not these reflections oppress you. I shall live without honor and be nobody anywhere. And then he says, it's not your business, is it, to get office or to be invited to a dinner party? Certainly not. And how is it you will be nobody anywhere when you ought to be somebody only in those things which are under your control, wherein you are privileged to be a person of the very greatest honor? But your friends will be without assistance. What do you mean by being without assistance? They will not have some coin from you. You won't make them Roman citizens. Well, who told you that these are some of the matters under our control and not rather things that others do? So what do we see here? We see him applying this very distinction in a way, talking to somebody else and saying, listen, buddy, the things that you're worried about, these are not things that are actually under your control. So you shouldn't be too focused on those. Another good example is in chapter 31, where he says, the result that you're looking for cannot be secured in any other way than by withdrawing your idea of the good and the evil from the things that are not under our control and placing it in those things that are under our control and in these alone. If you think any of those things that are not under our control are good or evil, then when you fail to get what you want and fall into what you don't want, it's altogether inevitable. You're going to blame and hate those who are responsible for these results. But you actually have control over whether you observe this distinction or not. And then in chapter 50, he says, pay no attention to what somebody says about you. This is very difficult to do, of course, but why should you not pay attention to what people are saying about you? He says, this isn't under your control. So you don't have to allow that to get to you. And I did want to use as a contemporary example, the body, right? So one of the objections that my students always have when we go over this passage is they say, well, wait a second. I do have control over my body. I choose what I eat. I choose whether I exercise. I choose whether I clean it up or not, like take showers. I choose whether I sleep the right amount. I choose the amount of stress I put myself under in some cases. What does Epictetus mean saying that I don't control my body at all? And Epictetus would say, of course, and he's got all sorts of exercise metaphors in his works. you can choose to exercise, but there are going to be some things that you don't really have much control over. I mean, as a 51-year-old man, I lift weights in part because I want to keep my bones from getting brittle, and I want to, remain strong and healthy into my old age. But I don't have control over that. I don't have 100% control. I mean, I could, well, look at this. I got COVID, whether I exercise or not, right? I could walk out from the gym and boom, there comes the bus and it hits me and I'm dead, right? Our bodies are things that we should take care of, but we don't have perfect control over. We control what we do with it to some degree, but we don't control all the outcomes. Um, you could say that we have partial control if you want to, and this is where the notion of a trichotomy of control comes in, and the worksheet that I provided you with, that you may find useful for that. It's interesting too. I'll point out, and then I do want to answer this question. The systems out there that are trying to sell us things to make our bodies better. Oh, you need to take these pills. Oh, you got to go on to, Nutrisystem to lose weight. Oh, you got to do this. You got to do that. Oh, go to the gym and do this kind of exercise. What are they really promising us? They're promising us that if we do something, we are going to have greater control than we actually can have. And a lot of people will pay lots and lots of money and spend lots and lots of time and devote a lot of desire and aversion and their feelings to things that they don't ultimately have control over. Being realistic about these things is incredibly liberating. All right, so let's take some of the questions. So Everett has 2 questions here. Do you think a person with dementia, Alzheimer's, has internals that they control? Yeah, I mean, until they're like completely gone from that, yes. But it's a much narrower, set of things that they have control over. And that's one of the things that really sucks about seeing somebody going through Alzheimer's, and in the early stages too, where people realize that they're starting to forget, they're starting to slip. They often get very angry at other people and at themselves because they feel like they ought to have all of their faculties with them, right? I saw my grandfather go through this and my great aunt go through this. And many of us have seen other people go through it as well. We don't know, to say that we have control doesn't mean that we have like perfect absolute control. None of us have that. Everett also says, would you repeat how you can respond stoically to negative self-talk? Well, I didn't actually say how you can respond to it. I just said that you can indeed respond to it. And one thing is, it's not particularly stoic. I mean, CBT teaches you this, and so do so many other things. You can respond to your negative self-talk by saying, this is not the reality of things just because my negative self-talk is telling me that. If my negative self-talk is telling me, don't apply for this job because you have no chance of getting it, or that person is never going to care about you, or you're ugly, or pick whatever else you like, right? I've got my chalkboard, right? You suck as a professor, right? You can say to yourself, and you can do this in a stoic way by using Epictetus and some of the things that he says. Why are you buying into that appearance, that fantasia in the Greek? That impression is another way of translating it. So that's one way. Andrew says, can't get my head around money as indifferent. I can't stop thinking about my income, which is low. I can rationally see how it's an indifferent. How can I accept it? By going further with the indifferent and realizing that the Stoics don't say that you should be indifferent to everything that's indifferent, right? That's a mistake. There are favored or preferred indifference, and then there are disfavored or rejected indifference. This is a very big issue, by the way, which I'm going to not fully address here because I've talked about this quite a bit in other places. You can just Google Gregory Sadler Stoic indifference, and you'll see several talks that I've given where I talk specifically about money and things like that. But the key is to slowly move your desires and aversions away from focusing so much on externals or indifference, right? And it's not to say that, again, you flip a light switch and suddenly all of this happens. This is something that requires going at it over and over again. But this is a distinction, and this is a practice that you can apply, and it will certainly make you better off in doing so. Let's go on to the next one, depersonalizing problems. So this one comes from later on in the Enchiridion. And Epictetus says, what the will of nature is may be learned from a consideration of the points in which we do not differ from one another. For example, when some person's slave boy breaks his drinking cup, you are instantly ready to say, and how many of us can relate to as not slaves, but saying this to other people, that's one of the things that happen. Rest assured then, when your own drinking cup gets broken, you ought to behave in the same way that you do when the other man's cup is broken. Apply now the same principle to matters of greater importance. Some other person's child or wife has died. No one would say, such is the fate of man. Yet when a man's own child dies, immediately the cry is, woe is me. But we ought to remember how we feel when we hear of the same misfortune befalling others. And so what are the basic concepts involved here? We tend to think that, or feel that, our own case is somehow different or special or exceptional. Whatever happens to me is somehow worse than what other people are going through. And we can remind ourselves that's a massive assumption on our part. It's a natural one because, we spend all our time with ourselves, right? We do care about what happens to ourselves, but we're just one of many, many beings in the world today and throughout all of history. And, we're all special in our own way, but we're not like unique exceptions to the nature of human beings. So, what is he telling us to do here? Remind ourselves about how we look at these things when it's other people experiencing or suffering these things. So if, when something bad happens to somebody else, we sometimes laugh at it. Maybe we should apply that to ourselves, or, more, we could say sympathetically, when we see somebody lose their job and we're like, well, I'm sure they'll find a way to manage. Why don't we say that about ourselves? Maybe we can. Or think about bad breakups, another great example. If you've ever had a friend and you consoled them by saying, well, there's many fish in the ocean, and then they're like, well, I only want that one fish. Oh, if you think that the logic applied to them, it also applied to you. And we can ask ourselves, we can distance ourselves from our own, immediate feelings and thoughts. We can say, well, how does my situation look from another person's point of view? And, we can also, by doing this over time, we can start taking some confidence in our own possibilities for responding in better and more reasonable, more free ways, right? That aren't going to make us feel quite so bad. Now, there are ways that people get mixed up about this. So, beginners will sometimes think about this in an immediate way and maybe overdo it, right? They think, well, if somebody else can deal with this well, I can deal with it well, right? So if my sibling, my friend, my coworker dealt with this thing, what's wrong with me that I can't, buck up and deal with it? And what we should do in those cases is think about, am I not an exceptional case, but what is it in me that makes me more susceptible to feeling bad, feeling down about this particular kind of thing? Let's take romantic relationships. If you've been hurt a lot in the past and your friend who you're looking at, who seems to go from a relationship to relationship without getting hurt, has a breakup and you're like, well, I should be like them when somebody breaks up with me. You might not be ready to do that until you figure out why you get over invested in people who aren't right for you or something like that. Another thing that beginners do too is they look at unrealistic stories about what so and so is capable of. And then they say, well, if they can do it, I can do it. Right. And they forget the fact that stories are often, made up or left out all the parts that are really important. So, if this celebrity can handle this situation, given all the stuff that they've got, all the resources available to them, well, then I should be able to handle it. Well, no, that's a mistake because you're not in exactly the same situation as they are, right? And we probably also don't want to take people who are just simply apathetic or disengaged, as good models for what we're capable of. We want to look at other people. So let's look at some of the examples that Epictetus uses. In chapter 5, he talks about death. He says, it's not the things themselves that disturb people, but their judgments about these things. You've all probably heard this passage. For example, death is nothing dreadful, or else Socrates too would have thought so. But the judgment that death is dreadful, this is the dreadful thing. So whenever we're hindered or disturbed or grieved, let's not blame anyone but ourselves. That means our own judgments. We blame our own assumptions or viewpoints about these sorts of things. Okay, so Socrates wasn't worried about dying. And if you want to know why, you can, read Plato's Apology, which, provides some of the arguments that Socrates uses. Likewise, Xenophon's Apology does as well. And there's something to that. We can say it's not necessary that we are worried about death. But that doesn't mean, again, that we can just like flip a switch and suddenly not be worried about it because Socrates isn't. We need to figure out why we're worried about it or why we're bothered about it. Another thing that involves Socrates is in chapter 33. It says, when you're about to meet somebody, in particular, when it is one of those people who are held in very high esteem, propose to yourself the question, what would Socrates or Zeno have done under these circumstances? Then you won't be at a loss to make proper use of the occasion. And, part of it would be Socrates or Zeno wouldn't be like intimidated by them. They wouldn't be, kissing their butt or anything like that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And so if that's a possibility for them, we can depersonalize it and say, well, that's also a possibility for me. But we don't have to go to Socrates or Zeno. We can think about people much closer to us in time and space who we particularly respect or think, have things put together. Chapter 16. When you see someone weeping in sorrow, either because a child has gone on a journey or because he's lost his property, beware that you not be carried away by the impression that the person is in the midst of external ills, but keep before you this thought. It's not what has happened that distresses this person because it doesn't distress another, but his judgment about it. Don't hesitate to sympathize with him as far as words go, and if occasion offers, even to groan with him, but don't groan in the center of your being. What is this saying? Again, this is saying you can apply that same logic to other people. You can say, well, they don't necessarily have to be as negatively affected by things because look at other people are able to handle that. But that doesn't mean that you don't sympathize with them. You can still go and say, oh yeah, it sucks that you went through this breakup or you lost your job or, your child has gone on a journey or you've lost your property or stuff like that. So some contemporary examples of this that I think could be useful for us, another indifferent or external reputation or social status. When we feel ourselves to be slighted or put down or humiliated publicly, we view it as an attack on ourselves. And, we can get very upset about that. And we can look at other people who were, in similar circumstances, and we can say to ourselves, well, I don't have to be as upset about this, or maybe I don't even need to be upset about this, period. That is a possibility for me. It doesn't mean that it automatically, makes us feel better, but we can say, yeah, this is a possibility for me. And that's very liberating as well. The notion that we can do this. We can also apply this to our own getting upset about other people not being upset. When we say, how can people, not be worked up about the fact that the government is doing this or the people that we're opposed to politically are doing this? Well, is that a necessary thing that we get angry and irritated and post mean things on this social media or that social media? No, because if Socrates was around in the present or Epictetus was around in the present, they wouldn't have to do that, right? So we can apply that to ourselves. And I think we can think of many other examples where we can depersonalize these problems. It doesn't mean that we become, depersonalized ourselves. It means that we adopt a wider point of view and we say, that doesn't have to get to me the way that I'm allowing it to get to me. So let's take a little pause here. Any questions, cases, comments people want to make about this second one of depersonalizing our problems that we have? All right, so there's quite a few here. Nancy. Okay, this is a good point. I like this. Another approach, switch on your curiosity mode and ask yourself, I wonder why this happened. Yeah. And you can do that with the outside things, right? I wonder why this person said the jackass thing they said. And Epictetus tells you the answer to that because they thought that was a good thing to do. They may be mistaken about that, right? But people are generally following what they ought to do. Welby says, how do you apply this to stuff like child molestation? I know extreme examples. Would it be appropriate to apply that, as the victim to say, oh, well, I shouldn't be bothered because, do we know that Socrates wouldn't be bothered by child molestation? That's a big assumption there. And, one thing I do want to point out, so there's a larger thing here. The Stoics sometimes are interpreted as saying you should put up with whatever abuse people give you because it's really all in your head. They're not saying that. They're not saying that at all. As a matter of fact, Epictetus will, as we're going to look at a little bit later, when he's talking about your brother being mean to you, actually being unjust to you, he doesn't deny that there's an injustice going on there, a wrong. And we can talk about some very, very deep wrongs, torture, child molestation, the kind of exploitation that destroys entire communities, right? Stoics think that justice is a virtue and that injustice is a vice. And if you look at what the Stoics did in their lives, they had no problem criticizing people for injustice and saying it was wrong, or even going to war over it, like Cato did against Caesar. So, depersonalizing it, you could say, well, what do I think about other people being molested? Do I say, it's just what happens? Or do I say, oh, this is really bad, but it doesn't have to destroy my life. It doesn't have to place me on you could say, path of replication of trauma. This is one of the problems that happens with people who are abused, right? They become quite fearful of themselves becoming abusers. You can look at, by depersonalizing this, you can say, well, that doesn't have to be a possibility for me, but what do I need to do in order for this not to continue, right? Michael says, when you feel attacked or insulted, you should examine the statement for a grain of truth. Yeah, examine it for a grain of truth. There may not always be a grain of truth there. Some people are just mean jerks. It has nothing to do with you. They're just belligerent. But yeah, sometimes, especially when you feel yourself attacked, but the other person says they're not attacking you, there might be something there to worry about. Marco says, is it okay to ask questions seemingly off topic, but what are connected to Stoicism in general? I would save those to the end. We're going to take little Q&As for each of the practices. And then I think we should have plenty of time left by the end to do more general Stoic questions. So let's move on to the next one. paying tranquility's price. Now, this is my own terminology for it. This is not something that I think a lot of other people call it, but it makes sense to call it this. So here's the passage from the Enchiridion. If you want to make progress, dismiss all reasoning of this sort. If I neglect my affairs, I shall have nothing to live on. If I do not punish my slave boy, he will turn out bad. For it's better to die of hunger, but in a state of freedom from grief and fear, than to live in plenty, but troubled in mind. And if it is better for your slave boy to be bad than for you to be unhappy. Now, here's the practice. Begin, therefore, with the little things. Your paltry oil gets spilled, your miserable wine stolen. Say to yourself, this is the price paid for a calm spirit. This is the price for peace of mind. Nothing is gotten without a price. So when you call your slave boy, bear in mind it's possible he may not heed you. And again, that even if he does heed, he may not do what you want done, but he is in not so happy a condition that your peace of mind depends on him. Now, I want to point something out. Most of us don't have servants, thank goodness. I think we live in a more egalitarian society these days. But what could you substitute for this? Your technology, right? Aristotle actually talks in Politics Book 1, where he's discussing slavery, about the possibility of looms and shuttles moving themselves. And he says, well, that happens. We don't need slaves for anything. We can just let the technology do it. We live in a time where we get quite upset with our technology for not doing exactly what it's expected to do, right? I've got Siri. Siri's actually not all that smart. Doesn't give you the right answers all the time. The app that I usually get most bothered by is the Maps app, because it will give you bad routes, right? As Michael has a good point here. Substitute children for slaves, not to use them as, but in not letting them take your tranquility. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about coworkers. We could talk about the printer. We could talk about, you take a sip of water. Oh, that doesn't taste good, right? We've got all these things that could be aggravations for us. They could be instances where we get upset about something. And I don't think that we're ever going to run out of examples that we could use for this. What we do is we keep in mind, okay, I pay a price for what it is that I want. What are my priorities? So here's a basic concept. Everything has its price, and they're not all settled once and for all in advance. We're the ones who get to decide what we're willing to pay in exchange for what. And a lot of times we make dumb pricing decisions, and we come to Stoicism having made a whole lifetime of dumb pricing decisions, in part because other people have been telling us stupid things about how things, ought to be exchanged for each other, right? So what we have to do is, and here's the practice, we have to determine what our priorities are, and then we have to stick with it. We have to remind ourselves when things are irritating. You get on the highway, and you ever had this, those of you who drive, you get on the highway and you're going up the on-ramp, and you get there and it's like bumper to bumper traffic, and you're like, oh, now I'm going to be late, and you don't know whether you're going to be late. Maybe it eases up a little bit later on. Maybe you're stuck in rush hour for 2 hours, but you say, well, not getting worked up about that, that's the price of tranquility. We don't have to worry about that so much. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to accept anything whatsoever. We are the ones who have been given the choice about how to prioritize things. And again, it's not something you can change automatically, but it is something that you can work on over time. Beginners often get mixed up about this. I have seen two main ways that I see people doing this. One is, looking at this as very cynical, and not cynical in the classic sense, but in the modern sense, because of all the talk about prices and paying, and saying, well, that doesn't have anything to do with a noble character. No, Epictetus actually thinks that it is something that's very, very important if you want to enjoy a happy life, a free life. You have to start looking at what you have been, charging things as. The other thing is focusing on the choices and deals that other people are making before getting some reasonable stability in your own. Stoicism is very much, especially at the beginning, about if you know this metaphor, eyes on your own paper, right? You've got to, instead of worrying about what everybody else is doing, and whether they're behaving in a stoic way or not, and what sort of, things they're valuing, look at your own life and figure out whether you are allowing yourself to get aggravated by things or not. So here's a great example that Epictetus provides. I love this one, as does my wife, because of, I think, the culinary things. Has someone been honored above you at a dinner party or in salutation or in being called to give advice? If these matters are good, you ought to be happy that they got them. But if they're bad, don't be distressed because you didn't get them. And bear in mind that if you don't act the same way as others do, with a view to getting things that are not under our control, you can't be considered worthy to receive an equal share with others. How is it possible for a person who does not haunt some man's door to have equal shares with the man who does? For the man who does not do escort duty with the man who does? For the man who does not praise with the man who does? You will be unjust, therefore, and insatiable if, while refusing to pay the price for which such things are bought, you want to obtain them for nothing. What's the price for heads of lettuce? An obol, perhaps. If then somebody gives up his obol and gets his heads of lettuce, well, you don't give up your obol and don't get them. Don't imagine you're worse off than the man who gets his lettuce, for he has his heads of lettuce, and you have the obol which you've not given away. It's the same way also in life. You haven't been invited to somebody's dinner party? Of course not. You didn't give the host the price at which he sells his dinner. He sells it for praise. He sells it for personal attention. Give him the price then for which it is sold, if it is to your interest. But if you wish both not to give up the one and to get the other, you're insatiable and a simpleton. Have you nothing in place of dinner? Indeed, you have. You've not had to praise the man you did not want to praise. You've not had to put up with the insolence of his doorkeepers. I mean, if we want to be very crude about this, you could say, if you want to get things from certain people, you have to kiss their behinds. And if you're not willing to do that because you don't want to kiss people's behinds, well, then don't get worried about the fact that other people have done that and they got those benefits, we have to decide for ourselves what it is that we truly value, right? So, some contemporary examples, using online platforms and technology, they're constantly being updated. I remember when Facebook, when I first got on it, when they went through their first change of look, and people were just outraged. Oh my God, I can't believe that Facebook did this to me, and I'm going to quit and stuff like that. A lot of them didn't quit, and everybody adapted to it eventually. What were they doing? They were letting something that doesn't matter at all get to them. They were paying a price there and throwing away any sort of tranquility. We get to decide what we're cool with and what we're not cool with. And, we do so within certain structures, you could say. Like he points out, if you don't pay for the lettuce, you don't get the lettuce. But you're the one who decides whether you pay for the lettuce. And so it's very important to look at what we're willing to trade things for. So let's take a couple questions. James says, you translated cacodæmonia as unhappy. No, I didn't. Old Father did, who was the translator who I used. Could you say something about a person's genius in Stoicism? No, I couldn't, because that's totally different topic. That's doesn't really matter here. Michael, Lord of the Rings quote from Gandalf that applies to being late, that is Stoic. I'm neither early nor late. I arrived precisely when I intended to. You did, but you did so, if we think about prices, at the price of missing part of the presentation. Fortunately, it is being recorded and you can watch it later. So, that's good. So Gabor has a good What if I'm so much overwhelmed already or so much stressed that I cannot control my answers to hard and stressful situations? I work a lot, have small children, do go for a run occasionally. It seems my reactions are out of control most of the time. I cannot stop ruminating. Well, you can't change it all at once. You can decide which things you want to work on. And here's a point where Stoicism is in consonance with many of the other, we could call them intentional ways of living or philosophies of life. You don't try to boil the ocean. You don't change everything all at once. Pick one thing that you want to work on and then be forgiving with yourself for the others. To get outside of Stoicism, I'll bring up somebody else who I do a lot of work on, Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm is talking about fasting, which is very, very important for the monastic life. And he actually tells some monks in his work, the De Similitudinibus, don't fast. Not that all monks shouldn't fast, but you, buddy, shouldn't fast, because when you do, you get really irritable with all your fellow monks and you're kind of an a-hole. Why don't you work on that part of yourself first? Then you can work on the fasting. And we can say the same thing with ourselves, So if you have, Gabor mentions working a lot, having small children, ruminating. Okay, so those are three different things. You probably can work on one of those, like being less irritated with the children. I mean, children are a lot of work. I mean, when I have my kids, I'm much more worn out, and they're adults now. Well, actually, one of them is an adult, one's a teenager. I mean, back when they were younger, man, kids demand a lot of energy. So maybe you can only work on that part of your life, and the other things have to, take a back seat, and you have to be a little bit forgiving with yourself and say, I'm doing the best that I can, but you're still able to make some progress, right? Atal says, is there such a thing as a very good bargain or unreasonable high price for these sorts of things? Yes, that's a great way to frame it. The cool thing about, again, Stoicism or other intentional ways of living is that there are bargains that are being put on the table for you. To be happy, you don't have to actually do that much. There's some things you have to be cool with giving up, right? But people have been making themselves happy with this stuff for over 2,000 years. So, and it doesn't require having, a high income or living in the right neighborhood or things like that. So there are bargains in this. And from a Stoic perspective, most people pay unreasonably high prices for most things. So that's kind of a cool way to extend the metaphor. Ricardo says, what if I have OCD? How can I manage my logic skills if my mind is playing with me? Well, we talked about this a little bit earlier, right? If you have intrusive thoughts, you decide what you want to do with those intrusive thoughts. Do you want to listen to them? Are you purely their victim, or do you have some measure of, responsiveness and control? And the answer is yes, you do. Nobody is totally, like a robot within the determinism of something else. And so, if you have OCD, you can learn how to live with it as so many other people do, or you can allow it to interfere with all these other things. And that does go to this price thing, right? All of us have things we struggle with. I mentioned earlier that I have struggled with depression since I was a teenager. I got into Stoicism in part to try to better understand and deal with anger, which I still have not, conquered as the Stoic sage or something like that. I still struggle with. We all have things that we struggle with, but none of them are outside of our control entirely, where we're just victims of them. A lot of the things do require this thing to be handled and this thing to be handled and this thing to be handled. And there are no, shortcuts or magic bullets that deal with everything all at once. But it is possible through, working with these practices and many others to do more and more, right? All right, let's move on to practice number 4. Valuing your will, or prohairesis. In chapter 4, Epictetus tells us, When you are on the point of putting your hand to some undertaking, remind yourself of what the nature of that undertaking is. If you're going out of the house to bathe, put before your mind what happens at a public bath. Those who are splashing you with water, who jostle you, who vilify you and rob you. And thus you will go about your undertaking more securely if at the outset you say to yourself, I want to take a bath, and at the same time, keep my moral purpose in harmony with nature, and do so in every undertaking. For thus, if anything happens to hinder you in your bathing, you'll be ready to say, oh, well, this is not the only thing I wanted, but I wanted also to keep my moral purpose in harmony with nature, and I won't keep it if I'm vexed at what is going on. So, one really basic concept. You notice that there's this term moral purpose there, and you might be like, well, what is that? What does it have to do with the will? The term that Epictetus is using is prohairesis. And this is a term that's a little bit difficult to translate. And you shouldn't try to find a single perfect translation for it, because there isn't one. It gets translated as will, as faculty of choice, moral purpose. There's a number of other translations as well. The key thing is that it's our capacity to choose. And it's also the core of who we are. There's a significant overlap with what the Stoics call the ruling faculty as well. In fact, some people think it's exactly the same thing in Epictetus. So whatever words you want to use for it, the point is, from a Stoic perspective, you, as the person you are, you have a measure of capacity to choose for yourself, including choosing how you use and understand that very capacity. You notice that he also talks about being in harmony with nature. And what does he mean by this? I mean, that's a much bigger topic that I've talked about in other places. You can easily Google it. Marcos is faculty, meaning something akin to ability. Yeah, if you want to use ability, but a faculty is like something that you have and you keep. It's not just an ability that you have at one single moment. It's, you could say, capacity. Again, don't worry about terminology so much here, right? Back to harmony with nature. For the Stoics, being in harmony or in accordance with nature means being in accordance with the way the universe, the world works, including the way things are structured, but also developed human nature, not a screwed up human nature, but what human nature is capable of. The Stoics thought that we are by nature beings that are rational, that have a capacity to tell right from wrong, not a perfect one at the start, but some degree of that. And we have a social or political, or however you want to put it, communal nature as well. And so, making your choices along those lines is using your prohairesis, or your faculty of choice. And you have the choice of what it is that you're going to focus on. That very choice is how you use that choice, right? You shape your prohairesis by how you use it. And so this involves a lot of prioritization. So you notice that this involves a lot of the things we've been talking about so far. You choose whether you pay attention to what's in your control and what's not. You choose what prices you're going to pay, right? You see how these start to come together. Now, ways that beginners often get mixed up about this is sometimes making it way too abstract in specific circumstances, and it becomes something like a Kantian categorical imperative. That's not what Epictetus is talking about. There's also a tendency to forget the fact that the prohairesis is something dynamic. It's something that we have input into, something that changes over time, right? So it's not something that you have once and for all. It's something that you work on, using it to work on it, right? And we can look at some of the examples that Epictetus provides. So in 38, he says, just as you're careful in walking about not to step on a nail or sprain your ankle, be careful also not to hurt your governing principle or your ruling principle. If we observe this rule in every action, we will be more secure in setting about it. So when you're in a situation like, of course, going to the Greek bathhouse, no, we go to the pool instead, right? And somebody does something we don't like. I don't know, they pee in the pool, right? You say, well, I can choose to be upset about that, or I can choose to keep my prohairesis in accordance with nature. That's up to me, right? Somebody splashes me, or people are loud, they're playing music I don't like, right? Or I go to the restaurant and, the waiter takes too long in coming to me. What was I obviously would like the waiter to come on time, but which of these am I going to prefer? It's up to me. I get to choose that. In chapter 13, he says, if you wish to make progress, then be content to appear senseless and foolish in externals. Do not make it your wish to give the appearance of knowing anything. And if some people think you to be an important personage, just trust yourself. For be assured, it is no easy matter to keep your moral purpose in a state of conformity with nature, and at the same time to keep externals. But the man who devotes his attention to one of these two things must inevitably neglect the other. So, this is good to keep in mind as well. And you have the choice between these. Which are you going to focus on? The third one that's really a great passage is chapter 9. Disease is an impediment to the body, but not to the moral purpose unless that consents. Lameness, this is something Epictetus knew quite well, is an impediment to the leg, but not to the moral purpose. Say this to yourself at each thing that befalls you, and you will find the thing to be an impediment to something else, but not to yourself. Notice the common aspect here. In situations that you get into, here's how it's a practice. Remind yourself that you have to choose. Prohairesis, which is what I am and what I bring to every situation I'm in, and that I have some control over, or other things. Which am I going to place the focus on? Great example, and then we'll take some of these questions. Great example that I can relate to that we actually encountered just a few weeks, actually just before I got COVID, going to a concert. When you go to a concert, people are recording with their phones. You see all these lights. They go back and forth constantly to get beers. They're chatting with each other. We were at a concert the other day, and there were these people that other people in the concert were like actually saying, hey, can you shut up? We're trying to listen to this music here. People get up and dance, and their dancing isn't very good. Sometimes the musicians aren't 100%, or the music isn't mixed well, or the lights don't work the way they're supposed to be. And you can say, well, why did you buy these tickets and make all the arrangements to get to the concert? Did you do it because you wanted to enjoy the show? Yeah, but sometimes you have to decide, are you going to focus on these negative aspects, or are you going to keep your prohairesis in accordance with nature? And it sounds a little artificial, you could maybe have like a little flashcard that you get out every once in a while, or put something on your phone, keep your prohairesis in accordance with nature. After a while, you get better and better at it. You get to recognize, oh, this is a place where I can decide between these things. All right, so Everett says, in the case the universe is deterministic, is our prohairesis actually the ability to respond to our deterministic universe? Determinism comes in a lot of different blends, so that's a sort of an abstract idea. The Stoic idea, there's freedom in the universe, and there's causal determinism. They're compatibilists, right? And there's many different versions of this, and so the answer, in a very trivial way, is yes, of course, the prohairesis is an ability to respond to the deterministic universe, and so much other things, like the ability to determine itself and determine whether we understand ourselves, and all these other things as well. Everett also says, is prohairesis the tool we use for paying tranquility's price? So that's a great question. You could look at it as a tool, right? But it's more than a tool. It is you. Epictetus, at one point in the discourses, says, you are prohairesis. And your prohairesis determines prohairesis. It's so free, even God, Zeus, can't reach in there and make you do things a certain way. So it is, you could say that it is connected with the prices. And it is one of those things that we can decide we don't want to sell, you see. So that's quite important. Everett goes on to say you can only choose what and how you react if you're relaxed enough. If you're out of your, I mean, this is a good more. If you're out of your stress zone, you cannot. It seems to me mindfulness is the key to Stoicism. Otherwise, the situation will trigger you. That's partly right, partly wrong. From the Stoic perspective, you're never like totally incapable of choosing some things, right? It can be more or less difficult for you. You don't have to, I mean, mindfulness is important. The Stoics actually call that prohairesis, attention. And that's a big part of basically all philosophies as ways of life, right? But you don't necessarily have to be doing mindfulness practices to do that. And you can, here's the cool thing, you can actually practice these things in your stress zone, right? You may not be able to do it right away, but eventually you can start doing these things and your life gets better and better and better the more that you can get into your stress zone and, you know, monkey around and fix things. So Marco has one of the keys here. If one is overcome by a strong passion, you should probably take a pause before reacting. And the Stoics advocate that. And Epictetus talks about that at a number of places. That's another one of the Stoic practices, taking a pause. And that, again, plays a big role in other ways of doing it. Even plays a role in science fiction. You know, in A. Van Vogt's, novels, he calls this the thalmic pause, right? You try to keep yourself from, you know, immediately reacting from the certain parts of your brain, right? So yeah, very important stuff. All right, let's look at the last practice. And this goes to a very famous quote, and I've given you a handout or a worksheet for this that may be useful. Picking things up by the right handle. Epictetus says, and this is in chapter 43 of the Enchiridion, everything has two handles, by one of which it ought to be carried, by the other not. If your brother wrongs you, don't lay hold of the matter by the handle of the wrong that he's doing, because this is the handle by which the matter ought not to be carried, but rather by the other handle, that he is your brother, that you were brought up together, and that you'll be laying hold of the matter by the handle by which it ought to be carried. Now, easier said than done, of course, right? As is the case very often with these matters. Notice something very important here too. Epictetus is not saying that the brother is not doing anything wrong or that it's all in your head. He says the brother does wrong the other person. This practice doesn't mean that the wrong goes away or that you ignore it or repress it, right? Those are counterproductive approaches to this. What this does involve is the use of the prohairesis on things that are in our control, what we want to focus on, how we're framing matters, what values we want to prioritize. Those things are up to us. And it may be difficult, right? Especially if your brother's acting like a jerk to you and they've been a jerk the entire time you've known them, or you're involved with a romantic partner and, they turned out to be the wrong person, or you've got a irritating coworker or boss or whoever, right? But we do have some measure of control over this. We're framing the matters. So we should think about, what does this mean to us, whether something can be carried or not, whether we can deal with it. Doesn't mean that we have to be like totally happy about it, but can we deal with it? And there are ways of looking at things where we can be sure we're not going to be able to deal with it. I'm a victim and I can never do anything about my circumstances. That's not a handle by which you can carry things around in your life. You're going to be miserable, Beginners often get mixed up about this, thinking that it means that you have to pretend everything is totally okay, that it demands like toxic positivity. That's not the case. Or enduring abuse that sets up or triggers other problems. I mean, this goes back to some of the questions earlier, and I do want to reiterate that Stoicism doesn't demand of you that if you're in an abusive relationship that you just suck it up and take it. That is not what you have to do. As a matter of fact, you could look at yourself and say, well, I matter too. I don't need to put up with this sort of thing. And especially if there's others involved, like, say children, you can say, well, I don't want that for my kids either. Um, Another way that beginners often get mixed up about this is being too prone to apply this to other people, to say, you need to pick things up by the right handle. Look on the bright side. The Stoics say you can deal with it. No, again, Stoicism is about focusing on your own page, right? Work on your own work before you start worrying about whether other people are measuring up to a philosophy that you're interested in that they may not even care about, right? So that's important. And Epictetus has some good examples here. He says, if someone brings you word that somebody's speaking ill of you, don't defend yourself against them, but answer, yes, indeed. They did not know the rest of the faults that attached to me. If they had, this would not be the only one that they had mentioned. Great example, right, of how to pick something up by the right handle. It kind of, makes you think about the situation. It very often disarms critics who are after you for one reason or another. In chapter 36, here's another nice one. Granted that for you to take the larger share at dinner is good for your body, still, it's bad for the maintenance of the proper kind of social feeling. So when you're eating with another person, remember to regard not merely the value for your body of what lies before you, one handle, but to maintain your respect for the host, another handle. Which one are you going to pick up? If you pick up the one, sooner or later, you're not going to have any dinner parties because you're a jerk and nobody wants to hang out with you. If you pick up the other handle, even though you don't get to eat as much as you'd like of whatever it is that they're serving, you get to hang out with other people. And here's another one that's very, very tough. And again, people often get quite upset when they hear this one. I've got a whole piece out there that you can easily find about Stoicism and relationships that discusses this passage. With everything that entertains you is useful or of which you are fond or feel affection towards. Remember to say to yourself, beginning with the very least things, what is its nature? If you're fond of a jug, say, I'm fond of a jug, for when it's broken, you will not be disturbed. If you kiss your own child or wife, say to yourself, you're kissing a human being, for when it dies, you will not be disturbed. Now, people hear that and they're like, ooh, those Stoics are cold and mean, right? The word there for feel affection or are fond, it already includes loving, philostorgia, right? Philostorgen. So he's not saying don't feel affection. It's just remind yourself of the way things actually are. Pick things up by the right handle. The wrong handle is everybody that I love because I love them is going to live forever and everything's going to be awfully great. Boy, if you carry things by that handle, you're going to have a rough time. People die, people get sick, people have misunderstandings. That is a handle by which you can carry something because it's realistic. If you think about our workplaces, right? Our work conditions sometimes suck, right? Pay and possibilities for advancement. And you can choose in a situation like that, what do you want to focus on? You don't have to pretend that your boss is good when they're not. You don't have to pretend that the pay is fair when it's not. But you can say to yourself something like, well, this affords me the opportunity to, provide for myself or my family while I look for a better job. Right? Or it could just be, well, this is the best that I can find, but this is indeed providing me with some sort of income. It's up to you how you choose to focus on things. So let's take some, we'll take questions specifically on this one, but then we can also take some more general questions about Stoicism as well. Marco says, connected to the topic of currency being traded, if you don't mind, what's the currency which Epictetus suggests you don't sell? Your dignity, your prohairesis, having to tell yourself that things that are false are true. Those are things that Epictetus would say you probably, you don't want to sell those things. And people do sell those things. And you can look at them and say, are their lives really happy? Or are they, even though they have like wealth and social prestige? Are they still miserable bastards, who blow up at people? Marco, didn't Epictetus praise Socrates and how he had endured abuse from his wife? Sometimes I feel Epictetus goes to such extremes, misinterpretation that sometimes seems inevitable if common sense isn't applied. So yeah, so there's a good point there. If you don't apply common sense and you want to be tendentious about it, or you want to misunderstand, as I think a lot of people do, well, then you'll misunderstand. But again, that's a choice that a person makes, right? And you actually got to sympathize with Xanthippe. When you look at Socrates and how he lived his life, Epictetus kind of idolizes Socrates. I kind of think Socrates was a bad dad and a bad husband, and sometimes picked the wrong battles myself. And when it comes to Stoicism, like Seneca says, we don't have kings. We don't have to buy every single thing, right? And just because Epictetus praises Socrates so much doesn't mean that we have to think that Socrates was as good as Epictetus hundreds and hundreds of years later makes him out to be. Corey says, I wonder if the currency might be our attention. That's a currency, not the currency. It's been said we most dearly pay for anything if we pay too much of our attention. There's lots of currencies, right? And so we decide which things we want to exchange for which things. There is no one single currency in this metaphor that Epictetus is using. Everett, when you responded to Marco's question about currency, what do you or Epictetus or Stockdale mean by dignity? Probably different things, and Epictetus doesn't have a word for dignity, so I wouldn't worry about defining it so much. I think that's something, substitute whatever word you want. Integrity, that could work too, right? Honesty. Elliot, less about the content. I'm wondering if there's a particular translation you prefer for the Enchiridion. I don't have preferred translations because I can read Greek. I actually did a whole video about this a while back because people ask me so much about which translation is the best. And my answer is, I don't know, because I'm not a good person to answer that question. The only reason I'm using the Old Father is it's convenient. I mean, obviously, I dislike translations that play too fast and loose with things, but most translations are okay, and I don't expect that much out of them. And whenever something gets kind of weird, I just go to the original language, and I'm fortunate in that I can do that for Greek, Latin, French, and German. Can't do it for other languages. Then I have to trust the translator, and I don't know if you can trust the translator. Like whose translation of Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard is the best? I don't know, because I can't check it against the original. So I don't have a good answer to translation. I have good answers to, like, how should we translate X, Y, or Z given this passage. I don't have good answers to whose translations are the best translations. James, there is some controversy in modern Stoicism about the degree, if any, to which we are fingers on a bigger hand. Yeah, my thoughts, I think there isn't a controversy in modern Stoicism about that. This is the first that I'm hearing about that controversy, and I'm on the modern Stoicism team. So if you mean questions like how ontologically dependent are we on groups and societies, that's an interesting question. The Stoics very clearly think that we have sort of a dual nature. We are individuals, but we are individuals who exist within society, right? And we are parts of larger wholes. That seems entirely uncontroversial because all the major Stoics say that. So I don't see a lot of a controversy about that. Marco, are we doing questions in general now? Yeah, I said we could do questions in general after we got through all the practices. So, Gary, I wonder what a Stoic would say to someone who asserts excessive emotions are part of human nature and as a consequence in accordance with nature. They would say they're wrong. That's pretty straightforward. Why would they say that they're wrong? Well, that's where we get into the nitty gritty. And there is a really, really good book that I can recommend if you want to get into understanding the Stoics on emotion. And that would be Margaret Graver's Stoicism and Emotion. Really wonderful book. She does a great survey of all the classic Stoic texts and thinkers on these matters. And here's where we can say, listen, there are different conceptions of what human nature is. And sometimes you got to pick one rather than pick another. You got to pick which seems more reasonable to you. I mean, for me, somebody who asserts that excessive emotions are part of a fully developed human nature seem to me naive and off base. And I think the Stoics are probably more right. I also think Aristotle has a lot of things right that maybe the Stoics don't agree with. But the idea that excessive human emotions are, I mean, there's being part of human nature and being part of like how us screwed up human beings react to things. Sure, the Stoics have no problem with saying that in the screwed up state that most of us are in, we have excessive emotions. Is that what we want? Is that desirable? That's a whole different question. Marco, how is virtue connected with Epictetus's concept of freedom? Virtue, freedom. They're connected with each other. Epictetus doesn't talk as much about the virtues as, say, Seneca does, or Marcus Aurelius, or Cicero in his summaries of what the Stoics say, but it's there, and if you want to be free, you've got to be virtuous. And what are the virtues that the Stoics recognize? These big four cardinal virtues, which each have their own sub virtues: wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice. So if you want a happy, free life, you have to figure out what those virtues are and start practicing them and developing them. And if you don't, you're going to be unhappy. Peter, what are your thoughts on Dr. Irvine's trichotomy of control? If we can influence an outcome, it would seem to me the outcome is still not a given. Would that still be outside of our control, or do I understand this incorrectly? I'll reference you to something that I've written about. I've got a piece out there specifically considering this. What does Epictetus think what Epictetus thinks is in our power? And I think that Irvine is helpful in saying, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things where we control the intention or the effort and we don't control the outcome. Do we have to set up a trichotomy? No, because Epictetus already talks about those sort of cases in the discourses as things where they're externals and we use them. The Greek word for that is chresis. And so I don't think that we need Irvine's trichotomy of control if we understand Epictetus sufficiently. Atal, how would you look at the usefulness of emotions as a means to judge a situation and what you subconsciously think of something so that you can react accordingly? Yeah, that's good work if you can get it. Most people's emotions are not sufficiently on point and have been, sort of messed up through, all sorts of misshapen desires and assumptions. So, anger is a great example. A lot of people think that because they're angry at something, now they have the right take on it and it can motivate them to virtuous action, and then they do horrible things, Emotions can be useful if they are, integrated well with rationality. That is rarely the case for most people, but it's certainly something that we can work on. Courtney, what do you think about the Stoics' concern it's unwise to let emotion, as opposed to some measure of emotion, as they carry us beyond what is reasonable? I think that the Stoics are pretty much right about that, and that Plato and Aristotle and those traditions agree, and so does the Epicurean. Everett, correct me if I'm wrong, but Epictetus talks a lot about keeping your moral purpose regarding aversion and desire. What if I don't really know what right or wrong is? Well, the answer to that is most of us don't know really what right or wrong is. We have some kind of mixed up conceptions of that, but we can improve them, right? And what if I don't believe that anything is morally right or wrong? Well, good luck with that way of living. I mean, nobody is truly a moral relativist when you get down to it. Those are very abstract worries that you don't really see playing out in real life. Gary, can you tell something about the most important differences and similarities between Stoicism and the philosophy of the 17th century Dutch philosopher Spinoza? Yeah, Spinoza has this incredibly static universe that's, essentially mechanistic, and there's only one substance, and that's God, and we're merely modes of it. The Stoics think that we actually do have selves, Spinoza's ethics gets rid of a lot of things that Stoics think are important. I kind of think that Spinoza is a overrated philosopher, and he's got kind of an aura about him, sort of like Hegel. With the phenomenology, a lot of people like talking about Hegel, but don't really understand him. I think a lot of people talk about Spinoza, but don't adequately understand him, because if they did, they'd be like, yeah, I don't want that, we're going to have to wrap up in about 5 minutes. So I don't know if I'll get to everybody's questions. Marco says, Epictetus's works are full of parables between the art of living and other arts. For example, carpentry. Do you have any favorite of his parables, you mean? Yeah, I mean, some that I put in here, like, picking things up by the right handle. I think that's a great analogy, right? We've got two handles. And if you've ever had to move people, right? And you like screwed up your back because you picked up things the wrong way, which I've done in the past. You learn this lesson about picking things up in a way that you can carry them. I also remember as a young man carrying, sheets of drywall from the attic, the fourth floor attic, all the way down to the basement in our barracks in the Army, and like doing it the right way, where I could carry massive amounts of stuff. And people were like, that's too much weight, and I'd be like, nah, man, I can do it. I think that's a great metaphor. There's all these wonderful metaphors. We do have to be a little bit careful, right, when we're dealing with metaphors, not to push them too far and say this is the perfect account of everything. We always want to keep in mind what the metaphor is saying. Adam says, Marcus talks about dropping an opinion. How could that be so easy? Nobody says it's easy, right? So why are you reading in Marcus telling you that it's simply easy? The Stoics know that this is difficult to do. You have to keep working at it and get, who is Marcus talking to? Himself. He's not talking to you. You're just an extra reader on the side. We happen to have benefited from Marcus's work, but he was writing to himself, sort of like saying, you dumb bastard. Why aren't you fixing yourself? Why do you keep making the same damn mistakes over and over again, right? All right, we got a couple minutes left. Let's see. Welby, how do the Stoics react to suffering, especially in terms of emotions, abuse, or torture? So there's two answers to give. How do they react to it directed towards themselves? And how do they act when it's directed towards somebody else? Like, for example, what if I find out that my child is being bullied? Should I, and again, something else I've written about in other places, because these are common questions that come up. Should I say to them, well, the Stoics teach that we can all be free, and, don't worry about those bullies. They're not insulting you. It's only your judgment. No, we don't do that. We recognize injustice as injustice, and we try to oppose it. And you notice that's what the historical Stoics actually did: oppose and criticize, and recognize that other people are not Stoics. And we can also recognize that about ourselves. We can say, I'm not the Stoic sage. I probably will have some trigger points that I got to watch it. I can put up with this much abuse and recognize that the other person, they are acting like a jerk, but they're doing so because, that's the way they were brought up, or they've got a bad character. And then at a certain point, I can say, okay, that's enough. I'm removing myself from the situation, or I'm opposing myself to you, right? That is something that while you're not a Stoic sage, and nobody I know has ever met a Stoic sage, that's perfectly okay to do, I would say. Atal has another good one here. Would it be appropriate to say that Stoicism is the solution to integrating rationality with emotion, or is there a different branch of philosophy that focuses more on it? Yes, both. Stoicism has a lot to offer. There is also the Platonic tradition, which includes Plutarch, who has a lot to say about the emotions. There's the entire Aristotelian tradition. Even the Epicureans, as Seneca recognizes, have some good stuff to say. And those are just an ancient philosophy, right? Then we could talk more broadly about incorporating wisdom traditions from other places than Greece and Rome. We can talk about moving ahead into the Middle Ages and the early modern period. We don't have to, if we want to, bring in Stoicism. It doesn't mean that we can only have Stoicism any more than we have to only be Cartesians or Hegelians or things like that. We can use multiple things, and I think that makes for a stronger way of working at things. So people are saying thanks. Thanks to all of you for showing up and helping me test this new platform out, which seems to be a success. It seems to have worked seamlessly as far as I can tell. Sarush, I think, is still here and getting to see it working in action. So that's awesome as well. And this is being recorded, so it should show up on the site for this, so you can go back over it if you want to. And now I'm going to go spend some time with my oldest daughter before she goes home for the summer from being here at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We're going to hang out and do a few things, but I'm glad all of you could join me for this. And you're all very welcome.